You chase pleasure like someone trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Maybe it's not desire at all, but a wound you've never dared to face. And today, with Jung as our guide, you will discover why lust might be the most dangerous mask you've ever worn. You feel it in those moments when the rush fades and the silence sets in, that quiet, uneasy void that no amount of stimulation can fill. You tell yourself it's just attraction, just a natural craving. But deep down, there's a part of you that knows it's something else entirely. It's the shadow, the unseen parts of you you've spent a lifetime ignoring, wearing pleasure, like a shield so no one, not even you, has to see the emptiness underneath. The illusion of control over lust is one of the most seductive lies the mind tells. You think you're the one choosing, but in truth, you're responding to a command written in the language of old wounds. The dopamine hits, the momentary high, they trick you into believing you're in power, yet the same cycle drags you back, again and again. It's like feeding a wolf that only grows hungrier. A hunger not for touch, but for healing you've never allowed yourself to feel. Jung believed that addiction is never truly about pleasure. It's about running from pain. That truth cuts deep because it means your pursuit of lust is not liberation, it's escape. And escape always has a price. There's a reason you keep returning to the same patterns, the same impulses, even when they leave you emptier than before. It's not because you're weak, but because the wound is still open. Lust offers you a momentary bandage, a quick warm cover over a gaping cut, but never the cure. And in those quiet moments after, when the world feels still and heavy, you can almost hear it, the voice of the shadow, reminding you that what you feed will always grow. If you've ever wondered why desire can feel so urgent, yet so hollow, why pleasure fades faster than the ache it was meant to erase, then what follows will strip away the illusions you've been clinging to. We will walk through 9 hidden psychological layers of lust, not to shame you, but to hand you the map you've been missing. It helps more than you imagine. You think lust is just desire, wanting something or someone so intensely that it feels undeniable. But lust is the shadow's disguise, as Jung would say, a costume your mind puts on to hide the wounds you don't want to face. It's not a calling toward pleasure, it's a shield against pain. In the moments when lust burns brightest, it's rarely because you are whole. It's because you are empty in a way you don't want to admit. It often appears in those silent hours after rejection, abandonment, or a hunger for validation you cannot name. Lust steps in as a mask, a blinding distraction, keeping you from sitting alone with what hurts. You convince yourself it's about attraction, about chemistry, but underneath, it is about silence, about smothering a voice inside you that is too raw to hear. That's why the craving feels urgent, but never satisfied. You feed it, and instead of calming, it grows louder, more restless, more insistent. The shadow is made of every part of you you've pushed into exile, your fears, your shame, your unresolved grief. When lust becomes the language you use to answer these hidden parts, it doesn't heal them. It fuels them. And the more you feed the shadow, the more it begins to speak over you, until it feels like you are no longer the one making the choices. But lust is not your enemy. It's a messenger. It's a signal flashing in the dark, asking you to notice what you've been avoiding. The problem is, most people never hear the message because they are too busy chasing the distraction. If you could stop and look at it, not as temptation but as a mirror, you might see the wound it's been covering all along. Yes, you will be afraid of what surfaces. But fear is not a reason to turn away. Ignoring the message won't make it disappear. It only gives the shadow more control. Jung warned that what we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves will rule us from the dark. When lust controls you, it feels like fate. But it isn't. It's a pattern. And patterns can be broken when you dare to face what's behind the mask. It helps more than you imagine. You've been told that pleasure is happiness, that the rush you feel is proof of life. But dopamine is not the same as joy. It's a promise of reward, not the reward itself. A chemical whisper that tells your brain something good is coming, without ever delivering what your soul is truly starving for. That's why you can have the moment, the touch, the rush, and still feel the same gnawing emptiness after. The brain loves dopamine because it's quick, predictable, and addictive. It rewards you for chasing stimulation, not for finding meaning. And so, without realizing it, you start confusing the chase for the prize. You begin to believe that another encounter, another body, another fleeting moment will finally be enough. But that's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. Every swallow only makes you more parched. Real joy doesn't spike and crash. It's not something that burns out the moment it appears. It's steady, quiet, grounding, and it's built on connection, purpose, and self-respect. The tragedy is that when you live in a cycle of dopamine hits, you lose the patience to build the kind of life where joy can grow. You're too busy hunting sparks to notice the cold that follows. The truth is hard. Stimulation is not the same as emotional fulfillment. You can be surrounded by intensity and still feel profoundly alone. You can have the thrill and still feel untouched in the places that matter most. And until you make that distinction, until you separate what excites you from what nourishes you, you will keep running in circles, mistaking speed for direction. Here's the revelation. Every time you feel that surge, you're not actually touching joy. You're touching its decoy. And the decoy will keep you busy long enough to miss the real thing. If that doesn't shake you, it should. Because the moment you see the difference, you can never unsee it. And once you've seen it, you can start making choices that actually lead somewhere. If you want more of these moments of clarity, where illusions break and you finally see the machinery behind your habits, stay here. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep dismantling the lies together. It helps more than you imagine. You think your desires are born in the present, shaped by who you are now. But the truth is, many of them are echoes from a much earlier time. The inner child is still searching, wandering through your adult life, looking for the safety, love, and validation it never received. And when it can't find them, it distorts its needs into cravings that look like lust. You might believe you're chasing a person or an experience, but you're really chasing a feeling that belonged to a different chapter of your life, one that never fully closed. Childhood wounds don't disappear when you grow older. They adapt. A lack of warmth can transform into an obsession with touch. A lack of affirmation can turn into a hunger for being desired. And the absence of security can make you cling to fleeting highs as if they could anchor you. Lust becomes the shortcut, the quick, intense surge that momentarily mimics the comfort you were missing all along. But like any shortcut, it doesn't lead to where you truly need to go. The tragedy is that the inner child doesn't want lust. It wants presence. It wants to be seen without being judged, to be held without condition, to feel safe enough to stop performing for affection. But because the adult self often doesn't know how to provide that, the child settles for what is available. Temporary distraction, emotional anesthesia disguised as intimacy. And each time you give in to that pattern, you reinforce the belief that this is the best you can get. If you've ever wondered why certain triggers feel so overwhelming, it's because they're not just touching your present. They're waking your past. That's why it feels primal, uncontrollable, as if resisting it would be like holding your breath underwater. But what's really happening is that an old need is demanding to be met in the only way it has learned to survive. Healing begins the moment you stop outsourcing that responsibility. The moment you become willing to sit with your discomfort instead of running from it. The moment you treat yourself with the same compassion you wish someone had given you years ago. Lust may shout the loudest, but the inner child speaks the truth in softer tones. Tones you can only hear in stillness. And once you start listening, the cycle begins to lose its power. That's when the search can finally end, not in another fleeting rush, but in a lasting sense of being home in your own life. You can fill your life with moments, people, and pleasures, but if there's no meaning underneath it all, the hunger never stops. Addiction thrives in the absence of meaning. It feeds on the emptiness left behind when your life is stripped of true purpose. Lust becomes the fastest substitute, the instant gratification that feels like fulfillment for a heartbeat, then collapses into nothing. And because the emptiness is still there, you chase again. The cycle continues, not because the pleasure is irresistible, but because the void is unbearable. When life feels hollow, the mind searches for anything that can create the illusion of being alive. Lust delivers intensity. It wakes the body, sharpens the senses, makes you forget the stillness you're afraid to face. But it's a counterfeit aliveness, a spark that burns out in seconds, leaving you colder than before, and without a deeper meaning to anchor you. It's easy to mistake that spark for the only fire you'll ever get. Purpose is not something you stumble upon by accident. It's built, often slowly, painfully, and with deliberate choices that don't deliver instant satisfaction. That's why lust can feel more appealing. It's quick, it's easy, and it doesn't demand the courage that real purpose requires. But the cost is high. Every time you choose the shortcut, you delay the long, slow work of building something that could truly sustain you. Jung understood that humans cannot live without meaning. Without it, we are pulled into the gravitational force of our impulses, circling them endlessly, confusing movement for progress. You can spend years like this, decades even, running in emotional circles, thinking the next moment of pleasure will be the one that finally fills the void. It never does. The breakthrough comes when you start replacing the false fires with real ones. When you stop chasing intensity for its own sake and start pursuing actions that connect to who you want to become. When you find work, relationships, and values that give your days shape and direction, lust loses its grip. Not because the desire disappears, but because it no longer has a monopoly on your energy. The void doesn't shrink by accident. It closes when you decide your life will mean more than the next high. And when you do, lust stops being the master and becomes just another voice in the crowd, one you can hear, acknowledge, and choose not to follow. The ego is not interested in your healing. It is interested in your survival. And survival, to the ego, means keeping things exactly as they are. The ego doesn't want healing. It wants familiarity. Even if the familiar is destructive, even if it keeps you in pain, it feels safer than stepping into the unknown. That's why when you get close to breaking free from lust's grip, the urge can hit harder than ever. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're standing at the threshold of change, and your ego is pulling every alarm it has. The ego is deeply invested in the identity you've built around your habits. If lust has been your escape, your comfort, your way of coping, then removing it feels like removing a piece of yourself. The mind whispers, if you let this go, what will be left? Who will you be? That question is terrifying, not because you don't want the answer, but because you've never lived without the pattern that defines you. This is why regression happens when progress is near. You start to glimpse the possibility of life, without the compulsion, and instead of feeling relief, you feel fear. Fear that you won't know how to exist in the quiet. Fear that you'll lose the familiar rush that has accompanied you for so long. And so the ego tempts you back into the cycle, not because you need it, but because it knows it can control you there. Jung would say this is the moment to pay the most attention, not to run from the urge, but to study it. What is it trying to protect? What story is it telling about who you are? You might discover that the ego's protection is actually a cage, one that's been keeping you from the discomfort that real transformation requires. If you can sit with that discomfort, instead of obeying the urge, you take the first real step toward breaking the cycle. Not because the desire vanishes, but because you prove to yourself that you are more than it. Familiarity loses its power the moment you stop mistaking it for safety. The ego will always try to preserve the old self, but the self you're becoming is built on choices that no longer bow to fear. And every time you resist the call to go back, you're not just avoiding an old habit, you're rewriting the story of who you are allowed to be. Numbness feels safe at first. When you've been consumed by intensity for so long, the absence of feeling can seem like relief. But numbness is a warning, not a solution. In the beginning, lust might have been about pleasure, about chasing a high that made you feel alive. Over time, it can shift into something darker. No longer a rush, but an anesthetic. You're not seeking ecstasy anymore. You're seeking escape from the weight of your own emotions. The danger with numbness is that it doesn't stay contained. When you start using lust to dull the sharp edges of pain, it eventually begins dulling everything else too. Moments that should bring joy feel muted. Relationships feel distant. You stop noticing the subtle beauty of your own life because you've trained yourself to tune out anything that doesn't deliver an immediate surge. And in doing so, you also silence the very signals that could lead you to healing. It's tempting to believe numbness protects you from hurt. In reality, it traps you in a smaller, colder version of yourself. Pain, as unwelcome as it is, carries information. It tells you where something is broken, where something needs attention. When you numb that pain, you also numb the possibility of change. Jung understood this. Repression doesn't make the wound disappear, it just drives it deeper into the unconscious, where it quietly shapes everything you do. The moment lust becomes a coping mechanism instead of a conscious choice, it starts rewriting your inner world. You might not even notice at first, until one day you realize you're not feeling much of anything. That's when you have to decide, will you keep living in this muted state, or will you risk feeling again, even if that means facing the discomfort you've been avoiding? Reintegration begins with presence. It begins with allowing yourself to sit in the quiet without reaching for the next hit of stimulation. It begins with reconnecting to your body not as an object of gratification, but as a home worth caring for. The return of feeling can be overwhelming. It can even hurt at first. But it's a sign you're alive again. Numbness is not peace. It's the slow erosion of your capacity to live fully. And if you can face what it's been hiding, you can reclaim a depth of experience no high can match. The choice is never between pain and nothing. It's between living numb and living awake. When the fire of lust finally burns out, what's left can feel unsettling. The stillness that follows isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's strange, even uncomfortable, like walking through a house after the music has stopped. When lust fades, what's left is the raw space it once occupied. And in that space, you meet yourself without the noise, without the rush, without the familiar patterns that used to drown out your thoughts. For many, this stage is mistaken for depression. The absence of stimulation feels like a loss, as if something vital has been taken away. But this isn't loss. It's recalibration. It's your mind and body adjusting to a new rhythm, one where intensity no longer dictates your sense of being alive. This quiet can feel threatening precisely because you're not used to it. You've been trained by the cycle to believe that stillness is emptiness. But in truth, stillness is the soil where genuine desire can take root. The strange thing about this stage is that the first real desires that surface might surprise you. They may have nothing to do with lust. They might be about connection, creativity, purpose, or self-respect. But they've been buried for so long under the constant noise of the compulsion that you barely recognize them. And when they return, they come without urgency. They don't demand you chase them. They invite you to build them slowly. This is the moment where patience becomes your greatest ally. The temptation will be to fill the space with something familiar, to reach for any spark just to prove you can still feel. But if you can resist that urge, you'll discover that the absence of lust isn't emptiness, it's potential. A blank page where the next chapter of your life can be written with intention, not compulsion. Jung understood that transformation is rarely about adding more. Often, it's about removing what was never yours to begin with. When the rush is gone, you finally have a chance to see which desires are truly yours and which were only shadows cast by the need to escape. That's why this stage, though uncomfortable, is not the end of your aliveness. It's the beginning of your real life. Stillness isn't something to survive until the next high. It's the moment you begin to realize that life doesn't have to be loud to be worth living. Real power isn't found in the absence of temptation. It's found in your ability to choose not to act on it. When lust has ruled you for years, it can feel like the only path forward is to somehow erase the desire entirely, but desire itself is not the problem. The problem is when desire becomes your master. True strength emerges when you can see the shadow, feel its pull, and still decide you will not merge with it. Most people think control means suppression, pushing the urge so far down that it can't be felt. But suppression breeds rebellion. The more you try to bury an impulse, the more it builds in the dark, waiting for the moment you are tired, lonely, or distracted enough to obey it again. Real power doesn't come from pretending the shadow isn't there. It comes from learning to stand in its presence without being consumed. When you can look at lust directly, without judgment or denial, you strip it of the secrecy that gives its strength. You begin to see it for what it is, a passing wave, not a commandment. In those moments, the urge loses its authority because you realize you are the one who decides what happens next. This choice, the decision to refrain not out of fear, but out of clarity, is where freedom begins. The peace that follows is different from the numbness you've known before. It's not about shutting yourself off. It's about no longer needing to prove your strength through constant battle. The war ends not because you've destroyed the enemy, but because you've stopped giving it the power to dictate your life. Jung understood that integration, not elimination, is the key. You don't kill the shadow. You learn to live alongside it. By doing so, you gain a kind of quiet authority over yourself, the kind that doesn't need to be demonstrated or defended. This is what makes choosing not to use your power so radical. It's an act of ownership. It's you deciding, in full awareness, that you will not trade your peace for a momentary high. And in that decision, you stop being someone who is merely resisting. You become someone who is free. The shadow never dies. It walks with you always, the sum of your denied impulses, forgotten memories, and truths you've tried to bury. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Lust lives in that darkness, and while it may never disappear, you are not condemned to obey it. Freedom isn't the absence of the shadow. It's mastery over how you respond to it. So much energy is wasted in trying to destroy what cannot be destroyed. People spend decades waging war against their own instincts, believing that to be good, they must amputate the parts of themselves they don't like. But the shadow is not a parasite to be cut out. As Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." If lust has been directing your life, it's not because you are broken. It's because you've never learned to speak the language of the shadow. Lust, in this sense, is a messenger. It reveals where you feel powerless, where you long for connection, where a wound has been left open for too long. If you silence it without understanding it, the wound festers in the dark. It will resurface in other forms, maybe through anger, maybe through anxiety, maybe through a different addiction entirely. Jung warned, what you resist persists. This is why suppression is never the answer. The more you push the shadow away, the more determined it becomes to be seen. Integration is the only path to wholeness. This doesn't mean giving the shadow control. It means acknowledging its presence and deciding with full awareness whether to follow its pull or not. This is where your real power lives, in the pause between the urge and the action. You can feel the weight of desire and still choose not to bow to it. You can hear the shadow's voice and treat it as information, not as an order. Jung's insight was radical because it freed us from the illusion of perfection. "I'd rather be whole than good," he wrote. A reminder that wholeness is richer than virtue because it makes room for every part of you, even the ones you wish were different. Perfection demands purity. Wholeness demands courage. And courage means standing with your shadow without letting it drag you into the dark. The shadow never dies, but it loses its grip the moment you stop fearing it. You'll notice that when you make peace with its presence, its voice becomes quieter. Lust no longer feels like an unstoppable wave. It becomes just one current among many, one you can step into or step away from. And each time you choose differently, you rewrite the pattern that once felt like destiny. You will feel the shadow's pull again. That's not failure. That's life. The question is not whether temptation will come. It will. The question is whether you will recognize it for what it is and respond from a place of strength instead of compulsion. That's the difference between being controlled and being free. If these words have opened something in you, then help me keep speaking them. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, not because it's a button, but because it's a way to say, I'm ready to see clearly. And clarity, as Jung might remind us, is the first light that makes the darkness conscious.